MacArthur Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science and the college. And his research interests have included the development of quantitative models of African American political behavior, identity, and public opinion, the political effects of urban poverty, and African American political ideology. Most recently, he has, with Megan Ming Francis, launched a nationwide effort to study the intersection of race and capitalism within the US, a project which no doubt has a little more urgency at its point. He also combines his quantitative work with work in political theory. In his first two books, Behind the Mule, Race and Class in African American Politics, and Black Visions, The Roots of Contemporary African American Political Ideologies, won multiple awards. Recent books include Not in Our Lifetimes, The Future of Black Politics, and Blacks in and Out of the Left. Michael is the founding co-editor of the Du Bois Review, and also the founding and current director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. He's been interviewed extensively by the print and broadcast media, and we're pleased to have him speaking for us today. That's me.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. The normal preliminary caveats. One is, I'm from Chicago, not New York, but I've been told I speak way too rapidly, particularly when I'm nervous, so you can slow me down at any point. And second, this is very much a work in progress, and it's the first time it's been presented anywhere, so A, it's rough, which is not an excuse, but B, I'm very much looking forward to your comments and criticisms. So I'm using this opportunity to talk with you to extend the argument in my article you read for today's session. Specifically today, I'm talking about racial capitalism from a vantage point of evaluating competing historical narratives of both the capitalist and racial orders. Analyzing the narratives is important, I argue, for understanding some of the central conflicts of our time in the US and elsewhere. To do so, I will start with the last section of capitalism. So Marx aims to, as you know, the first volume of Capital was analysis of primitive accumulation. As he puts it, capitalism's original sin, and that's his phrase, is paradoxically a rosy dawn. A dawn that began with, quote, extirpation, enslavement, and entombment of the indigenous population, the conquest and plunder of India, and the hunting of black skins. Yet for Marx, these atrocities form, quote, the prehistory of capital. This was Marx's historical narrative from the moment of primitive accumulation. What happened in the colonial world was outside of the capitalist system. Recently, critical race theorists have extended our understanding of primitive accumulation and historical narratives to the lens of racial capitalism, where both Marx's historical narrative embodies one of capital and that of a school of thought in the category of known as Afro-pessimism needs to be reconsidered. The error is taking the enslavement of the black body as an instance outside of capitalist development, either as prehistory, as for Marx, or as subject to perpetual terror outside the dynamics of a capitalist social order, as for the Afro-pessimists. The logics of racial domination and capitalism are inextricably articulated with each other, I will argue, and both must be dealt with. A global system of racial capitalism is the result that has regional specificities and widespread commonalities. Both must be understood. I will begin by discussing the origins of this work. Second, I'll briefly summarize Marx's argument of primitive accumulation. Next, I'll present the viewpoints of the Afro-pessimists. And from there, I'll quickly summarize the argument for a colonial-based model of primitive accumulation, argued for by, among others, Owner Insect and Akil Singh. I then summarized how two theorists a generation ago argued specifically that the intersection of race and capitalism within the U.S. can be best understood through the lens of internal colonialism. I'll end, if there's time, when I type these at home, it always takes a lot shorter period of time than I do in front of an audience. So if there is time, I will end with a brief discussion of implication for contemporary politics. First, a bit of background. This work flowed out of a theoretical discussion that I had with friends and colleagues over the past several months about the current crisis in Black and other communities of color. It also flows out of my work with Megan Ming Francis on Black politics and the neoliberal racial order and the changes that have occurred since the era of Jim Crow in politics. the American political economy and our racialized civil society. I can only sketch the bare bones of the argument in these other work, but hopefully the paper you read and this talk will provide a fuller account. Having been regularly inflicted with images of savage state and white experience of violence, directed at individual blacks, such as the 2016 murder of Walter Scott in South Carolina. Interesting. I've read this part of it several times over the last several months. I guess the last 3 days have changed my opinion of this. Which echoed the 2014 police murder of McDonald's in Chicago, and so many other attacks, such as those of peaceful immigration protesters, who were shining lights on the government detention centers run by for-profit prison companies, and black institutions such as the tragic massacre of Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina.
It's too fast for me. Sorry, is that?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, don't apologize, because I'm trying to get through it.
Because it's so important. I want to understand it.
I'm going to try to rush through it because I'm getting too emotional, which almost never happens. At the same time, we have witnessed racist violence directed at minorities. Astute observers have begun to comment on the underlying economic policies that undermine, in all too many cases, exploited these communities, from Oakland, California to Baltimore, Maryland. Peeling back the layers and explicitly examining the linkages between race and capitalism is necessary to address the escalating racial crisis in the contemporary period. For example, my collaborator Megan Francis and I argued in Public Culture and elsewhere, the Great Recession has intensified the harmful effects of the intersection of race and capitalism on racially marginalized communities. Recovery of the black workforce, for example, after the Great Recession has been slow and is unlikely to fully rebound. Particularly catastrophic or discriminatory housing policies and the foreclosure crisis, which decimated generational wealth and asset accumulation. Specifically argued that the Great Recession had multiple negative effects on black communities, which I don't have time to go through here, but which I'll be happy to do in question and answer. Just one recently identified effect in the literature that it directly led to an acceleration of residential racial segregation. Racially diverse neighborhoods had very high rates of foreclosures as compared to majority white neighborhoods, leading to those areas to become more segregated. These effects were magnified in the South and the West, where there were higher rates of foreclosures and more fluid patterns of residence within metropolitan areas. These are just a few of the reasons why it's urgent to untangle the relationship between race and capitalism in the U.S. It's not just a compelling intellectual problem, although I do think it's that, but it's also one that has effects on the well-being of citizens within the U.S. as well as also directly affecting the quality of American democracy. This is a background for the work I'm presenting today. So let's start with a short review of Marx and primitive accumulation. For Marx, primitive accumulation is not the result, and this is quote, of the capitalist mode of production, but its point of departure. The capital relation presupposes a complete separation between the workers and the ownership to the conditions of realization of their labor. So-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than a historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It appears as primitive because it forms a prehistory of capital and the mode of production corresponding to capital. Unquote. For Marx, the capital era dates from the 16th century, and many authors note his analysis and his historical narratives are both centered on particularly experience of enclosure in England and the dispossession of the clans in Scotland. These are paradigmatic examples for him. But as many have also noted, it's not a consistent story even within the last section of Capital Volume 1. For example, he argues, while the cotton industry introduced child slavery into England, in the United States it gave the impulse for the transformation of the earlier, more or less patriarchal slavery into a system of commercial exploitation. In fact, the veiled slavery of the wage laborers in Europe needed the unqualified slavery of the New World at its pedestal, unquote. Marx emphasized the New World slavery as well as the wage slavery of the Old World, part of the globalist capitalist system marked by the entanglement of all peoples in the net of the world market, and with this, the growth of the international character of the capitalist regime. The entanglement includes, at least in this section, of this discussion of primitive accumulation, the colonies, where conditions are so brutal that, like in the colonies, this beautiful illusion is torn aside, unquote. The illusion of free contracts and the equal standing of owners of capital and owners of labor. Yet Marx quickly continues, however, we are not concerned here with the conditions of the colonies. I will argue that paying attention to the place of the colonies in the global capitalist order will help us make better sense of not only the relationship between systems of racial domination and capitalism, but of capitalism itself. Temporally, particularly when he's arguing on a theoretical plane, Marx's narrative is one of an epic of capital accumulation that began unevenly in the West and is followed by the emergence of the capitalist social order. As Nancy Fraser summarizes in another article other than the one that you read, Marx's views, a key component of which is that capitalism is a system of regime of free labor. But as the historian at the University of Michigan, Jeff Ely, and others remind us, much of the world's economies from well into the 19th century would not fall under this regime. An alternative perspective also rejects the central role for colonialism or understanding the intersection between capitalism and racial domination. Specifically for the latter is a system of anti-blackness. For the past few years, a branch of critical race theory, Afro-pessimism, has gained a number of supporters in and out of the academy. Scholars such as Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton claim that slavery provided a starting and essential rupture, one that was essential for the development of capitalism, but also a rupture that puts black bodies and black people outside of the logics not only of capitalism but colonialism as well. This is a development, they claim, that is immune to changes in the political economy. Sexton argues, for example, quote, the application of the law of racial slavery is pervasive, regardless of variance or permutation in its operation across the better part of a millennium, unquote. It continues by stating that blacks suffer, quote, gratuitous violence exterior to the interlarded rationales of the colonial enterprise, including its systems of patriarchy and class warfare. Unquote. Thus, instead of using the term people of color, Sexton argues that it's more correct historically and in this period to talk about not a division between people of color and people of European descent, but between black and the non-black. I agree with some of the Afro-pessimist arguments, such as when Frank Wilson argues that the enslavement of blacks was a condition for the development of global capitalism. I also agree that this marks the inception of a set of anti-black logics that have taken on a life of their own and render black lives less valuable and ultimately disposable during this entire historical epoch. But I disagree when they homogenize the black experience. Not understanding, as scholars such as Michael Ralph and Andrew Zimmerman have shown, that blacks, such as many in several countries in Africa, have played a number of roles vis-a-vis colonialism and have been valued differently by capitalist states and managers depending on those roles. Finally, only a type of stubborn blindness and refusal to see the interrelationship between capitalism and racial domination can lead those such as Wilson to argue that, quote, we were never meant to be workers. In other words, capital white supremacy's dream did not envision us as being incorporated or incorporative. From the very beginning, we were meant to be accumulated and die. Unquote. Well, no, blacks were meant to work, die, and be accumulated as need be. By understanding the difference and similarities between different groups of racially dominated peoples and their relationships and their different relationship to global capitalism, we will be able to understand the complicated relationship between systems of domination. Contrary to traditional Marxists and the Afro-pessimists, Owner Insay proposes a different model, one that views capitalism as an irreducibly colonial formation with global inception. One consequence of this approach is that, quote, a colonial perspective populates the putatively homogeneous space of capital relation with multiple and heterogeneous social forms that primitive accumulates and transforms and articulates into fluid networks of capital accumulation, unquote. A colonial approach allows one to avoid the pitfalls of both traditional Marxist approach and those of Afro-pessimists in thinking through the relationship between systems of racial domination and logics of capital accumulation and expropriation, thus replacing the nation state with the early modern colonial empire in his view. As I noted in the paper you read for today, Insay argued that a consequence of the colonial approach is that it centers on the the role of the military, police, and other institutional violence for managing colonized populations, a centering that is still very useful, I would argue, for understanding how racially dominated populations continue to be attacked today. Thus, the world gets divided between the citizen subject, on one hand, and the barbarian savage, with different modes of logic in place in terms of both groups' relationship to the state, the economy, and civil society. Insay argues, quote, the history of colonialism pushes against Marx's formal definition of primitive accumulation. He continues, Marx's theoretical definition has a homogenizing effect that is very strongly rooted in the experience of England and Scotland, while his historical narrative is more complicated. Marxist, Insay argues, historical narrative is more complicated. Yet, quote, unfortunately, this contradiction is resolved in Marxist narrative in favor of homogenization. Insay is right to argue that having a global perspective draws our attention to the heterogeneity contained within global capitalism, including temporal heterogeneity. Even within a given region, subregions have substantially different experiences of how and when they are drawn into global networks of expropriation, accumulation, and oppression. A global perspective also directs our attention to the role of the state, as we see how often naked violence is used to bring regions and peoples into networks of global capitalism, and how relatively infrequently market forces alone are sufficient. Drawing on Rosa Luxemburg's work, Insay argues, quote, force is a permanent weapon in the formation of the colonial sites of third-party extraction and the networks of accumulation down to the present day. Nicholas Singh, in the suggested reading, shows how colonial logics become a global system of racial capitalism, complete with an ideology of white supremacy that as early as the period before the U.S. Civil War led white workers to refuse to work side by side with free blacks. The logic of a racial social order, trumping for white workers any notions of class solidarity. A dynamic that Singh, following W.E. Du Bois, states has, quote, haunted, unquote, progressive politics in the U.S. ever since. Singh argues against Afro-pessimism of the approach that, quote, alienates an understanding of slavery tied to the development of capitalism with any impulse to overcoming the problematic severing of racial domination and class subordination. He also criticizes Marx and Marxists for paying insufficient attention to the emergence of racial logics and categories and their implications for understanding the history of capitalism and its political as well as economic dynamics. Singh wants to replace Marx's statement from Capital that, quote, capital ceases to be capital without wage labor, unquote, with the following. This is Singh's version. Capital ceases to be capital without the ongoing, I can never say this word, differentiation of free labor and slavery, wage labor and unpaid labor, unquote. Thus, integrating the capitalist social order with the order for racial domination and patriarchy. It should be pointed out that Singh's approach does not displace an analytical focus on either the logic of capital or anti-blackness. For example, I agree when he argues Atlantic slavery emerged as a cornerstone of capitalism's articulation of exploitation, appropriation, and dispensation over the long 16th century, but it also bequeaths something else, an enduring cheapness of black life. Colonial approaches give us a better understanding of the articulation of the logics of racial domination and those of capitalism. I now turn to the work of two authors from the 1970s for an approach that allows us to, at least I think, better understand racial capitalism within the U.S. within a general framework that takes colonialism as central to capitalist development as well as theories of capitalism. In the 1960s and 1970s, a Detroit auto worker, James Boggs, once wrote a series of incisive essays that not only analyzed the intersection of race and capitalism in the U.S. of his time, but also dissected the political tendencies that led to the, what I would call, virulently racist presidential 2016 presidential campaign. A number of these essays were collected in the book Racism and the Class Struggle. This small book was extraordinarily influential when it was published in 1970. It had a profound effect on the black movement of his time, similar to that of Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, autobiography of Malcolm X, Carmichael's and Hamilton's Black Power, Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, George Jackson's Blood of My Eye and Soledad Brother, and Eldridge Cleaver's Soul and Ice, as well as M. Carr Cabral's Revolution and Getting. There was a canon of works about black liberation at the time that serious activists and scholars read, analyzed, argued over, and all are worth reading by today's activists and scholars. Bach's volume, particularly influential among the black radicals, who argued that what they saw the twin evils of the system were racial domination and capitalism, or at least in the U.S., inextricably linked. Nearly a decade later, political scientist Mario Bracero published Race and Class in the Southwest, less polemical than Bach's book. Nevertheless, they shared multiple points of agreement about how the intersection of race and capitalism in the United States has led to a gendered system of domination within the U.S. and oppressive communities of color. The major disagreement between the two is on the status of whites, and particularly the status of white workers. Both works directly challenge the type of logic found in works such as those of the philosopher Richard Rorty, who in 1997 defended the early and mid-20th centuries old left, ignoring of racial oppression, the movement he lamented that had been displaced by particularly the Black Power movement as well as the Chicano and Allied movements. Rorty argued, quote, but it really wasn't that bad, unquote. It continues by arguing that the demise of the old left was a tragedy despite its economic determinism that assumed, quote, racial discrimination in particular would prove to be a byproduct of economic injustice, unquote. Though he claimed the old left was misguided, he mourned its demise throughout the manuscript. He repeatedly mischaracterized what was at the time he was writing, the new left, ignoring and also ignoring as if it did not exist, and it did not exist for him, the non-white left. He could not see how racial and economic oppression intersect and reinforce each other. Bach and Bracero, who published 20 years earlier, were all too familiar with these arguments of a substantial segment of the white left that refused to recognize how the system of racial domination and white supremacy shaped American capitalism. This refusal led to all too many in the left throughout the 20th century in the U.S. to misidentify the most robust, militant, and mobilizable populations. I'm going to spend a little time on Bach's and Bracero's work with an eye toward their relevance for our times. They both emphasize, unlike some contemporary scholars, that our analysis must be grounded in a dynamic analysis of both the capitalist social order and the system of white supremacy. So at the beginning of racism and class struggle, Bach outlines a system of racial domination that he saw as oppressing black people in the United States in the 20th century. He argued, quote, the United States is the only colonial country in the world which fought a war for independence from the mother country that not freed its slaves, and 80 years later fought an internal civil war which allegedly freed those slaves, by having allegedly freed them, systematically set them aside on the basis of race as an underclass from whose super exploitation the rest of the population could benefit. The concept of super exploitation is central for Bach. His argument that is within a racialized labor force, workers of color are super exploited due to their race, as colonial labor is super exploited in external colonies. Thus, quote, the economic advantages of having a colony inside its own border has been tremendous, unquote. Economic development has been the reason for the super exploitation of blacks at every stage, and the super exploitation of blacks has in turn accelerated economic development, according to Bach. The result, he argued, was that white workers also benefit from the system of internal and colonial super exploitation. Unlike Bracero, Bach argued that white workers were not suffering from false consciousness, but, quote, the slogan black and white unite and fight, which explicitly or implicitly accepted by so many liberals and radicals, is based on the erroneous ideal that there's been a working class unity between the races in North American history. The fact is that white workers have been gaining at the expense of Negroes for so long that for them to unite the Negroes would be like cutting their own throat. After the Negroes were set aside to be systematically exploited, every white immigrant who walked off the gangplank to make his way to America was walking onto the Negroes' backs, unquote. The difference between Bach and Bracero about the status of white workers was one that would deeply divide leftists of color throughout the 20th century. Where they agree is that the perception of white interests can be manipulated to build racist populist movements and include large numbers of white workers, as was seen at the time that Bach was writing, and to some, surprisingly strong primary challenge that racist former Alabama Governor George Wallace mounted in the 1968 Democratic Party primary for the presidential nomination. One could, I wouldn't do this, analogize the 1968 race to what happened a couple of days ago. Like black radical intellectuals and activists throughout the 20th century, such as Harry Haywood, Bach also insisted that since the struggle of blacks against black oppression threatened the dismantling of the entire system. It was itself of a universal, not a particular nation. The black struggle is not, according to Marx, primarily a struggle for rights. It is a struggle against the system, a system, quote, of keeping Negroes at the bottom as an underclass, uneducated, and unskilled, unquote. Similar to the argument Insee made, a key aspect of the system argued was the force of the state and the state apparatus, both illogical and coercive, for managing the inner city ghetto. Fundamentally, as several scholars of this generation have continued to argue, at the heart of this exploitation was the conviction that people of color were not men, but subhuman, not self-governing citizens, but natives, unquote. Marx argued that as early as the period of his books, blacks had become disposable due to changes in U.S. capitalism and U.S. economy. Automation in particular had rendered the black labor force superfluous. The black struggle for economic advancement was disadvantaged because it occurred, quote, when there was a general decline in the number of jobs, unquote. It continued, the whites blamed the Negroes for disturbing their dream of America as a land of opportunity. Who then were blacks' allies, Box Acts? They were all the colored peoples all over the world struggling for freedom and independence against the West, unquote. This was the answer in the 20th century provided by Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, and general the entire radical wing of the Black Liberation movement. Blacks also foreshadowed what would become the emergence of a new black elite that today we see as a black elite that has embraced neoliberalism. A generation ago, at the beginning of this tendency, Box noted, quote, the power structure from its highest echelons to the middle classes is seeking to incorporate or integrate a few elite Negroes into the system and thereby behead the black movement of its leadership. Some contemporary scholars, such as Lester Spence, have argued that this attempt has been all too successful. Box asked a question that is still deeply relevant for, actually skip this section, move on. As usual, it's going slower than I timed it. We'll move to Bracero. Bracero, a decade after Box, analyzed the political economy of the Southwest and focused on what he saw as the racial oppression and economic exploitation of Chicanos and Chicanas. Bracero also argued that U.S. capitalism was organized as a racialized internal economy. Specifically, quote, a colonial labor system exists where the labor force is segmented along ethnic or racial lines, and one or more of the segments is systematically maintained in a subordinate position, unquote. More specifically, according to Bracero, Chicanos and Chicanas represent a colonized class segment. Unlike in Box, there's a beginning of an intersectional analysis that looked at the gender nature of the racialized workforce in the Southwest. But much more analysis along these lines was needed of a political economy shaped by the intersection of race, gender, and class. The origin of this system, according to Bracero, was found, quote, in Chicano history, which could be said to start with the Mexican-American War, an episode in the territorial expansion of Europe and European-derived societies that began in the 15th century. The manner in which the original Chicanos came about links Chicano history firmly with the history of other cerebral people who have been subjected to the colonial experience in one or another of its forms. In this case, the imperial expansion of the United States resulted in internal colonialism, a condition which Chicanos had shared with other racial minorities, unquote. For Bracero, the state activity aided the colonial economic expropriation of Chicanos, his preferred term for residents of the Mexican descent in U.S. territory. He actually does not use the term Chicanos. It's very rare. It's less than five times the entire book. Bracero, in some ways, did a better job than Box at demonstrating the state's role in direct expropriation of subordinated racialized populations, as well as their aiding of the capitalists in their quest for profits. There is a substantial difference with Box in that, by and large, Bracero argued that white workers do not benefit from the racial exploitation of blacks and Chicanos. For him, employer practices lead to racist attitudes among white workers. These attitudes then, quote, have a life of their own, unquote. These practices felt the white employers wanted to subordinate and super exploit Chicano workers, but white workers generally wanted, as also was the case we see for black workers, wanted to exclude Chicanos from the labor force entirely. This exclusionary tendency laid the ground, according to Bracero, in the 1970s for the movement that would lead to the Trump phenomenon. As Bracero noted, multiple media from the 1970s on promoted hysteria that claimed, quote, illegal aliens exacerbated unemployment, expanded the welfare rolls, led to greater rates of crime. Bracero insisted that white workers' anti-non-white worker animus was a function of employer manipulation and not consistent with their interests, as Boggs claimed. The claim, according to Bracero, and he uses the phrase, a false consciousness. The characteristics of a racialized labor force were concluded for Bracero being marginalized, a dual wage system, a segmented labor force that could serve as a reserve and or buffer, that was in turn also disposable, repressed, and rarely integrated into the mainstream economy. Even the Chicano middle classes, according to Bracero, were supporting class segment. Throughout the 20th century, resistance was waged by Chicano labor, and Boggs does a similar analysis of black labor struggles and black power movement more generally. Like with blacks in Detroit, the unions were an integral factor in maintaining a racialized labor force within the Southwest, as Chicanos were relegated to the bottom of the occupational structure. Still in the modern period, Bracero argued, overall unions mitigated the effects of the racialization of labor. Yet the power of unions when he was writing in the Southwest and elsewhere was weakening, and Bracero worried that ultimately the Chicano labor force, like the black labor force before it, would become largely disposable. Specifically, he argued, quote, if the marginality hypothesis is accepted, it would follow that racial minorities in the United States constitute a disproportionate share of the vast sector of the population. The impact on Chicanos of these results is likely to be much the same given the structural position of Chicanos and blacks in economic system, unquote. It's with this pessimism tempered by respect for Chicanos and Chicanos' history of resistance that Bracero's books concluded. Let me conclude by saying a few things about today. The first sentence of Boggs' book declared, quote, the articles in this book were not written for all time, but for our time. So what insights, if any, do these two books provide for us for our time? Rereading Racism in the Classroom, which I haven't done in way too long. I felt really old, but that's becoming more of a current experience anyway. I was depressed by the fact that we are still fighting the same dangerous battles. There are still those, including some black political scientists, who argue that talking about anti-black police brutality, racial disparities in health or poverty is to forestall a politics of class. This argument was dangerous. I think I used the phrase dangerously idiotic, but I was going to be nice. Over a century ago, when Frederick Douglass' son was told that the left could not fight lynching because it divided the working class. It was dangerous during the period of racism and class struggle was risen when the activists of the black workers movement were told that paying attention to the super exploitation of black, brown, and Asian workers in the U.S. would divide the working class, and it's a dangerous argument today. But in these neoliberal times, the greater danger is from the fragmentation of black and other communities of color. As a limited economic base derived from neoliberalism made a relatively new black middle and upper class willing to accommodate themselves in a world where they have fairly open and not, in all cases, access to privilege that partly shields them from racial subordination. It'll be interesting in the next few years to see if they still believe that they are shielded by their class position from racial oppression of various types. Many who champion the fight against poverty and the racialized oppression found in our poorest communities of color are more comfortable with the idea that only very slow, if any, incremental progress is possible to address the problems of those caught in the vice of multiple systems of domination, including those of class and gender in addition to race. The black united fronts that were common as difficult to forge and awful fragile of the black power era are even more problematic today due to the enticements that neoliberal ideology and to a lesser degree policies offers to many affluent blacks and others. On one hand, and the desperate poverty described by many scholars that makes it extraordinarily difficult for the most devastatingly disadvantaged communities to organize. The conditions found in black, Latino, and other marginalized communities are different today than they were at the time of race and the class struggle and Race and Class in Southwest's publication. But they still have to face some of the same questions today, both scholars and activists. Today, I'm going to skip to the end. Today, activists and scholars who conduct similar analysis for these times. We're at the beginning of a stage of a dangerous new period of economic and racial crisis engendered by the rapacialness of neoliberalism and subsequent breakdown of the deal where some of the super profits expropriated from internal and external colonies were transferred to a predominantly white middle class and a substantially white working class. Trump's candidacy is a symptom of the breakdown, as I argue, of the bargain, meaning with some sectors where white and male privilege would be combined with a small share of the economic spoils of super exploitation and colonial expropriation for class peace in the U.S. and elsewhere. Last night we hosted a scholar from France, in DIA, who was talking about how the Trump victory is being used quite skillfully by Marie Le Pen and the National Front in preparation for the upcoming presidential elections in France. Too many are willing to believe it when they are told their problems are all due to brown, yellow, and increasingly black immigrants. They're willing to believe it's the fault of those greedy blacks in their dangerous ghettos, who have nothing to lose, we were told, still looking for a handout, and it's due to those that pray differently than they do. None of these groups were ever considered to be fully citizens, but now for all too many, some of these groups are slated for removal from these shores, while the rest of us would be under an increasingly militaristic form of racial domination. As we find ourselves in a new period of racial domination, one even more dangerous than that within Dawson Bracero work, new works that deeply analyze the contemporary contours of racial capitalism are needed. They're needed not only to deepen our scholarly understanding of the intersection of race and capitalism, although that is an important reason to do so. They are also needed to provide a map for the difficult context within which today's activist struggle against terrific obstacles for racial, economic, and social justice. Thank you. Questions at this point, or?
Yeah, if we want to open for discussion, you can see hands better than I can.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm trying to get a handle on, and I appreciate you referencing Boggs and Cabral and these earlier sort of this kind of literature addressing this issue. I'm trying to get a handle on exactly why this break, because it seems to me that what you're presenting is, this is a long-standing sort of critique, an argument, but seemingly there's a break where this is no longer in vogue. This way of analyzing the relationship between labor and race, has dropped out. Is that a result of sort of the late 80s, early 90s, sort of rise of the neoliberal, yada, yada, or is there something more significant, as if that's not significant enough?
I was thrown by the more significant part. Truthfully, I don't know, because I think there's so many factors that have led to the break. One, I think, is the rise of neoliberalism. So when I was first doing some work in political theory, I was a tenured associate professor here about 20 years ago, and I presented work on some of these theorists. I was told, why are you doing this? They're activists, they're not really intellectuals. And I sort of muttered something about Machiavelli being an activist. And then some other of the canonical people I had to study in grad school also had more than one toe, in the politics of their time. So part of it is sort of dismissal of anything activist-related, particularly by people of color. Second is that I was introduced to this material, well, some of it was in study groups in the movement, but a lot of this material I was introduced in Black Studies classes taught by people like Sinclair Drake. But Black Studies departments have become a lot more conservative since back there in some year in the Jurassic. So when I was a member of the Black Studies department at Harvard, not that long ago, I was told by somebody named Henry Louis Gates Jr. That only outdated scholars believe in structural explanation for disadvantage and disparities. And that was the party line. As I agree with him totally. I was not Harvard material. Combine that with, I think, I'm not sure about this, but this is a hypothesis on my part, is that there was a bigger break in the Black movement after the disintegration of the Black Power movement to this time than there was, let's say, between the old Black left and the new Black left. So I think there's a lot less of a memory. I mean, I remember hearing people like C.L.R. James or Drake and others talk about their experiences organizing in the 1920s in Hampton, or the problems they had with the Communist Party in the 1940s. That type of transmission, I think, has been less frequent for a variety of reasons. So I think there's a lot of different reasons. I'm not comfortable yet, partly because I'm not a historian, to say which one was dominant, but I do agree that this is what was accepted wisdom, not just among black radicals, but among liberals and others, has dropped out of our sense of how to think about the relationship between various forms of disadvantage and domination, systems of domination.
Right. Thank you.
Sorry for rambling.
No. I mean, and I ask that question because these are the figures that I teach my students. And there's very little sort of echo, right? I don't see other sort of scholars still plumbing the depths of their works. I mean, you talk about sort of the understanding of, from the black leftist perspective, what exactly constitutes the aspects of human drive, right? And it's like, it's not this question just of rational economic material choice, right? Which would say, well, it's false consciousness that these laborers are engaging in, these white workers. But you understand sort of their composition to be also these sort of social psychological needs, right? So you get Du Bois saying, well, it's the wages of whiteness. And that's what really drives them more so than the seeming economic rational choice.
Yeah. And the other thing that was starting to develop in the 1970s, particularly among black feminists and other feminists of color, were critiques of multiple systems of domination that was beginning to reject the ideal that sexism was sort of like sexism was like racism, right? It's just an epiphenomena of capitalism. Things are, no, patriarchy has been around a very long time, very ingrained in our families and in our society, and that you have to study it as a system of domination as well as how that intersects with racial systems of racial domination. They have their own logics. They are connected and linked in ways that I'm trying to understand and suggest. But that doesn't mean that just dealing with one of them, the other ones are going to go away, get better, whatever, however you want to put it.
I really appreciate you ending with a kind of attempt to theorize what's going on now, and also a call to action for all of us to continue thinking about that and producing scholarship or writing that will address some of these intersections of race and the capitalist social order. I've been, as probably a lot of people, obsessed with reading about, what's been happening right now, the current election, or end of the election now. And there's articles who are talking about, this is a rejection of neoliberalism, that this is, which I critique, but there's other people who are saying that it's, that can't explain everything, that white supremacy has to be thought about as well at the intersection of neoliberalism. And so many, if you look at the way in which, voter dynamics or the exit polls and all that have been, it's not just kind of working class people who were voting for Trump. So, someone was talking about how it's not just about neoliberalism, but a desire to restructure neoliberalism in favor of white groups. And so I was wondering if you could talk more about your thoughts on the intersection of those things today.
Yeah, I feel a lot safer ground there because I do public opinion on my day job. For the first time in probably since certainly since I came to grad school, but maybe before that, I didn't immediately look at the exit polls and try to get my hands on data just to discuss it. But I finally did yesterday. And I think it's messier and more complicated than a lot of people want to admit. So there's certainly one way to cut it where I think we could see this in the primary campaigns in both parties, where there's just the models that predicted the election best were the ones that didn't look just at the raw economic indicators like GDP or unemployment rates, but looked at people's confidence in the economy. what they thought their futures of their families were going to be. So sort of like the public opinion about what they think their future were much better predictors than just doing the raw sort of economistic models that my discipline likes so much. So economic frustration, dissatisfaction, fear, which I think many of us would argue is very well grounded, given the history of the last generation and certainly the last decade, was part of what drove both support for Sanders and Trump. There's certainly also the view that the mainstream of both political parties have been captured by forces that are out of touch with the base of those parties. But this is where those multiple logics are also those who are most virulently anti-immigrant, or for that matter, anti-black, those are great predictors of support for Trump as well. Those who wanted to roll back what modest gains there have been in terms of LGBTQ rights and rights for trans people, also were very much came out in ways that they hadn't voted, rates they hadn't voted before. So there is a linking, I think, in many white Americans' mind of a path where their economic future was secure, and that security was based on certainly keeping people of color in their place, not just within the U.S., but globally as well. I mean, there's certainly a global narrative about what U.S. power should be doing as part of this. But also, at least for some of these voters, a narrative about putting everybody back in their proper place, whether that place is a closet, the kitchen, barrios and ghettos, etc. So it's all above, and certainly makes thinking about how to reverse these trends very difficult.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts about guest worker policy, low-wage guest worker policy, and we're talking about superfluity, the unemployment, and yet on the part of elites, there's a demand for this kind of policy, and how we make sense of that dynamic globally, nationally, racially, politically. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm trying to think through that more. I found rereading Bracero very useful because he has a discussion of the Bracero Program.
Right.
And the Bracero Program was started, for those of you who may not know, in World War II by the U.S. government at the behest of a number of industries, particularly agriculture, but also mining, extraction industries in the Southwest, to bring in Mexican guest workers to replace white males who had gone off to war. And one of the points that I didn't know about the Bracero Program, it's just not a good reflection on me, but one of the things I didn't know that Bracero talked about, it was the most highly unionized sectors in the economy that were the Bracero Program hit first. So the political clout of unions were used to, like in railroads, to kick out Mexican workers early. So there was a very strong link between the organizational force of white workers expressed through AFL unions and the ability of the state to manage labor flows and shortages. So I think we see some of the same psychological dynamics today, which is that organizing of a certain base of white lower middle class and white working class to fight elite demands for demands of firms for cheap and flexible labor.
Why are the firms going for, the cheap and flexible labor? Again, we have unemployment, you're talking, and I guess Moish was talking about the problem of superfluity, right? We have superfluity in the nation, and again, unions in the kind of most recent failed drive have made their peace with guest workers now, right? It's a kind of bargain, and I guess, not that it's it just seems that what you're talking about, colonialism and migrations of people, and the kind of complexities of class and racial domination. It seems so kind of squarely to raise all the complexities of construction, reconstruction of a working class and racial domination. And so.
One of the things that, I mean, just to talk on the firm side for a second, is that it was a belief, this is from the work of Donald Deskins, who was
Who?
Deskins. He was an urban geographer that worked on the auto industry in Detroit many years ago. But he had done a quantitative analysis of where Japanese auto plants were being located. And what he said was that the best model that he could fit was one where the auto plants were in metropolitan areas and as far from black and brown populations as possible. And so he just decided to ask the representatives of the Japanese corporations in the U.S. why they did that, and them not being trained in U.S. PR said, oh, because the big three told us to do it like that. They told us that the black and brown populations were way too, that the unions could keep the black and Chicano and Puerto Rican workers under control, and therefore the white labor force would be more easily, less resistant to policies that the firm wanted to implement. Now, I don't know if this is true or not in terms of but that's what the corporate leaders in the U.S. believed in the 1970s and 1980s. So I think there's still a belief among certain HR departments in many corporations that you don't want black or brown, well, you certainly don't want black workers, and you may not want brown workers as well, at least if they're from the U.S. And that we saw some of this after Katrina, this is through the work that Oxfam and others did, in terms of the firms were surprised because when they brought in labor from India and Mexico to help rebuild the Gulf, they started organizing. And started not only organizing, but also organizing with local workers, and this was not a dynamic they expected. But the belief among the firms is that these type of labor supplies are more easily managed, and if they have problems, they can always get rid of them.
I was just going to compliment the question. Guest workers, H2A, H2B, aren't citizens and don't have citizens' rights, so they can't organize. So it's just complimenting, I think, what you were saying already. So. Mark Linder, do you know his work by any chance? He's a law professor at the University of Iowa who was a farm worker attorney in Texas Rural Legal Estate, and it was called that. And he's written a lot. I mean, he's actually, I think, originally a political scientist, and he's interesting to read. Difficult because he's not the greatest prose writer. But he's pretty good. Nice on some of these issues of intersection between labor and foreign workers.
So is there, and I was, in class yesterday was talking about how with the deindustrialization that all these changes, I think he said, are not pretty. So that they come at a cost. And as I think about this, I think one of the costs that you could say is for the white blue-collar class, manufacturing going away and the like. And it seems like Trump, therefore, was taking that into account in terms of some of his appeal. It isn't all of his appeal, but some of his appeal is to that segment of the population. And so as I think about hearing your presentation, I wonder, to what extent do I root for Trump insofar as he will, and I have a sympathy for that too, for white blue-collar people who are to what extent do I root for him in terms of how he's going to make their lives better? To what extent is that going to be at the expense of the expropriation of other groups who are not even at that level in terms of having access to privilege and the like? And so I'm trying to, is there a space in which Trump can be successful, whether intentionally or not, but he can be successful at providing for that blue-collar white class, making their lives better, but not at the expense of other groups who are going to suffer even more than they suffer presently.
I think that what he's going to do is a lot what the Democratic Party has been doing for its base. which is provide symbolic types of victories. Some victories that may not be symbolic, but which will have absolutely no cost in terms of changing, let's say, rates of return on profit. So I can see, I think, affirmative action's gone. Marriage equality's gone. So there's going to be a lot of symbolic things we'll see rolled out, probably a lot in the first 100 days, that might provide some type of psychic satisfaction for blue-collar white workers, maybe. But I just don't think that we're in a regime now under capitalism where the type of social democratic pacts where you could say, we're going to take as Cecil Rhodes said, we need the colony so we can buy off the working class of London. As he was getting distressed by seeing working class Londoners mobilize. I don't think we're going to see that. I think they're going to take their chances. I don't think we're going to see a redistribution and a small amount of profits being channeled to a small segment of the working class or middle classes in order to buy social peace. There will be some symbolic things done or things that have nothing to do with capitalism per se that will be done that are more than symbolic. But I think life will get economically worse for all groups at the bottom, regardless of race and ethnicity.
Yeah, you acknowledge that you weren't a historian, but it seems like you know a lot about the 20th century. And even with that perspective, do you have any thoughts on 2016 as a quote-unquote turning point?
Yeah, political scientists sometimes talk about, and particularly those inside the United States, critical elections. And that was a popular way of thinking about American electoral cycles when I was in grad school. So 1932 would be one, 1896 would be another, 1856 I think was one, but one of the ones before the Civil War was as well, might have been 1860. And that theory was discounted for a variety of reasons. Some of it was political. Critical election theory tend to be identified with senior radical political scientists. But also because some of the stronger claims of critical election theory was that they were cyclic. And if you run the numbers, I don't care what your ideology, if the numbers don't work. But that said, I think there are elections in American history that are a turning point. And we are seeing that way and can be thought of that way, even if it means that, if for another reason, it means a realignment either within a party or between parties, or destruction or of parties. I think it's too early to say, but I would be very surprised if 2016 does not turn out to be a watershed election. It can go in a lot of different ways. I think for one thing, we're looking at the most unified government that we've seen in a very long time. So I think we're going to see a massive sheaf of policy changes coming out of the Supreme Court, coming out of Congress, coming out of the bureaucracies, even greater than what we saw during the Reagan era.
I wanted to go back to the reading of section 8 and primitive accumulation that you gave in the beginning, and I was thinking, like most of the Marxists today who are doing a sort of revisionist reading of Capital, they're not going to section 8, right? Like they're going to somewhere else in the book and then bringing out some implications, and more often than not, they miss out the intersection of race and capitalism that is so important and crucial to readings of capitalism today, right? And so I feel I'm really interested in this in the reading that I feel you started with here, and I was thinking especially like usually when we read that section, it's we think about primitive accumulation and how that led into the rise of proletarianization, and then how that's so important today and so on, right? And how those structures still work. And so how do you think that bringing out of the intersection of race and capitalism at this point, like let's say even in the 18th century, right? Like during like Eric Williams's thesis being you have monopoly capitalism and you have slavery, and then there's this immense growth in the 18th century and so on. But what about, is there a tension right? That like racial capitalism actually comes from a tension between slavery and capitalism, right? Like if you think about these 18th century abolitionists, they were, you know, critics of slavery, and then they supported a certain type of proletarianization, right? And so it just like got me thinking about, you know, how can we mobilize this part of Marx and primitive accumulation to today, kind of critique this, you know, this intersection today, and say, well, maybe what is coming out of this century is the beginning of a new beginning of racial capitalism, maybe. Like that is, you know, if you don't think that slavery is a capitalist economy in the way that it became in the 19th century and so on, what do we see then insofar as racial capitalism is concerned? Or is there nothing new there? Is there like, there's no kind of rupture?
You mean, where are you saying the rupture?
Like in the 18th to the 19th century, like that period. I know you're not a historian.
Well, that's also the part of the paper I took out because it wasn't developed enough. No, I'm serious because there's some implications about temporality, and I was thinking of Bill Sewell's article on temporality for capitalism, and I did take that section out, in fact, this morning, because I just decided it wasn't developed enough. Because there are different readings. Part of Bill's argument is that, at first blush, because you know, Bill is a genius when it comes to theorizing events, temporality, logics of history. That on one hand, at first blush, capitalism can be extremely eventful. I mean, you know, it's remaking continents, it's remaking peoples, it's moving populations all around. But on the other hand, there's these long cycles, and the cycles keep, regardless of context, particularly as regions get pulled into global capitalist order, you see these homogenization effect and these long cycles, which he says really undermines his earlier work on events being the key concept for trying to analyze history in the way that he wants to. Now, in a section I'm still working on, he then decides that there's a way to reconcile his theory of events with the long cycles of capitalism and how capitalism itself remakes events. But I'm not I think there was a rupture, but I'm not sure the implications of how that works out over time into our time. I mean, the only part of it that I'm very clear on personally is that the argument of people like Sexton and Wilderson, who argues that there's something about anti-blackness that, just from the temporal, there's other things I probably within their argument, but their temporal argument is the invariant across time. Changes in political economy doesn't change the status of blackness, globally or locally. That, no. No, I don't think you can look, I'm too much of an empiricist to accept that as an argument. I just don't think it matches any of the evidence we have, particularly when looking at what's going on, you know, among neoliberalism and black populations in the United States. It also, I think, does a grave injustice to black populations outside the United States because it just flattens them and makes the U.S. center the black experience in the U.S. as the experience for black people in the globe. No, again, no. So, I think there's a rupture. I know these systems are changing systems of domination are changing over time, both in response to each other and shaping and being shaped by each other. I don't have a theory of that yet, and I don't have enough empirical knowledge to be able to be confident in beginning to theorize.
So this summer, right, one reads thoughtful conservatives thinking that the Republican Party needs to reinvent and re-theorize what it's doing. And if anything, this election shows that the Democratic Party needs to rethink and re-theorize what it's doing. Someone, as you're talking about Oakland and Flint and Baltimore, and we think about the West Virginia miners, and we think about racial domination, can we even, I mean, you know, I'm a historian, I think about the past, I don't know about the future. To think about a reinventing of democratic parties that can deal with the crisis in the inner city and the crisis of the West Virginia miners. I mean, Sanders, right, tried to to do that, right? I mean, is there a possibility to wed a democratic politics that deals with racial domination and capitalist domination that is even in the, I mean, it's just the failure of the Democratic Party to do that, right? It seems to me as we look back since the 60s, since the Great Society, since...
Yeah, and it's not just a failure in the U.S. Been talking to people last night. It's a failure of the Socialist Party.
Democracy, right.
Yeah, Socialist Party in France and Labour Party in England.
I mean, it's like Germany with their industrial policy. Anyhow, so could you share some of the thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's possible. I don't think I can go on unless I want to just play video games for the rest of my life. There's somebody that could do that.
I wish I were a cat. I mean, that's my consciousness.
If I don't have any hope for a social world that's livable in the next 50 years, I have to think it's possible, although it might not be the Democratic Party, but it is more generally thinking about progressive liberal forces, or however you want to characterize them. There has to be a way I think it's probably going to start from the bottom up in many ways, in communities like Oakland or Flint, where the West Virginia miner and the 20-year-old kid from the inner city can agree that we don't like each other, we don't like each other's music, we won't admit to liking each other's food. Certainly don't like the way you carry yourself, but we have common interests. And that's what we have to, and there's things that where maybe our interests don't align, but we have to find those issues. And I think Sanders was starting that, but in every radical movement that I know of, from the late 19th century through this period, the question that people have had to ask themselves, and I have friends on both sides of this question, to what degree can we find those common interests and then bracket misogyny, bracket race? Can we I mean, I obviously have a position on this because I was referring to a political scientist named Adolph Reed who says that talking about anti-black police brutality is not helpful for bringing unity to the working class. But how do you expect black people to be in the room if you can't talk about police brutality? That may not be the issue that brings you together, but I don't know how you ignore the issue either. And that's the language we don't have.
I mean, thinking about your question, I mean, Fred Hampton popped into my head.
Yeah.
And the sort of work he was doing where he could sort of organize within sort of the south and west side of Chicago, but still reach out
Rising Up Inward.
Yeah. So,
Which
I mean,
was a white radical group not just white, not white radicals are the ones I worked with at Stanford, but white radicals who were from West Virginia and Kentucky. They were the sons and daughters of hillbillies that Hampton was organizing with.
Yeah. But I wondered if we were talking about sort of the deepening of spatial segregation and just the lack of physical contact between these populations now, and the sort of ideological and media static that separates. So now you can't walk down the street, cross the railroad, say, hey, let's have this conversation. Now you really have to travel these great distances to begin to,
and
have that contact.
One of the things that worried about me, what are the institutions of civil society that brought people that like each other together?
Unions.
Unions and military.
Yeah, they're
The military.
and they're smashing the unions.
And the military is now much less diverse than it was when I was trying to avoid going to Vietnam.
I really appreciated the essay that you assigned for us to read. I hadn't read it before. And what I liked about it, many things, but the use of trying to integrate ideas of exploitation with expropriation. And Fraser picks up on that too. And I guess Harvey has a pretty strong idea of dispossession. And I wonder how much of what's facing the lower classes, lower middle classes, that working classes and so on in the U.S. now, is that they are being marginalized from union jobs that no longer exist. And so, yeah, the West Virginia 20-year-old there and 20-year-old in Oakland, neither really have much of a prospect for a well-paying job that's going to integrate them into some kind of a Fordist capitalist system.
one of the things I think I need to theorize, or I know I need to theorize and I haven't done anything like it yet, is thinking about the role from production, communities of production to communities of consumption. So the south side of Chicago was a community of production in the sense that people worked at the port plant in Chicago, or summer jobs people had summer jobs in the steel factories in Gary in East Chicago. And so people's lives were based around various types of labor. The other major employer was the state. And now those communities are being told, much like communities in rural America, your economic feature is Walmart. So there seems to be, in some ways, the kid from Oakland and the kid on the farm in Iowa have many of the same problems in terms of what do I do if I want to have a decent living? Go to the military? I mean, that's not even the ladder to social mobility. It was a generation ago. So what I think the kid from Oakland has not been given, at least in 30 or 40 years, a convincing argument about what their future should be, can be. That's better than what they see, which is why a lot of black kids in their teens think they're not going to be beyond the age of 25. But the myths, if I can call them that was motivating or sustaining hope in the rural areas and in other areas in the parts of the country that voted for Trump, have also disappeared, and what Trump is giving is a new narrative about how things are going to change.
Just sort of continuing in that line, I'm wondering your thoughts about, in terms of re-theorizing the connections between production and consumption, the role of the gig economy, sort of beyond Walmart in this, but really thinking about sort of promise, because that's, in a sense, to be a producer, you have to consume this technology, right, to be able to be part of this economy. So, it'd just be interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think the idea of the gig economy is beginning to, I think it was beginning to have a positive inroads into at least black communities, because I remember I've talked to a number, this is all anecdotal, so, I did have a professor who said it's plural of anecdotal data, but most of my professors are quantitative when let me say that. That there's a narrative in the black community that, let's say Uber, is one. I think the second one is at least in Chicago, true, providing services in parts of the city where the cab companies would not go. And the second is providing jobs that black people couldn't get in traditional cab companies. Uber's labor parties being very much bracketed in that narrative. Now, there's studies that just came out, I think, a week or two ago before the election saying that, oh, by the way, Uber drivers do discriminate against black passengers. Clearly, their labor policies. Airbnb has been notorious in terms of the sort of racialization, everything from its web pages to the way some of their vendors treat prospective black and other potential residents of color. But there's a narrative out there that says this is the new model for hope. One of my students who dropped out of the Bracero Program here to first work for Barack Obama and then ran for city council, resigned from the city council this year, become a vice president at Airbnb. So there's another narrative for an upper middle class that is much clearer, but that is very much a neoliberal narrative about translating political and technical resources into economic success. But they are that group of people who I know somewhat, in my class position, very much sells the line that we benefit, in the same line that Walmart says that we benefit the lower white middle class, the white working class and lower middle class. They have a line that Uber and other parts of the gig economy benefit black workers and poor black The problem is, I don't think we have an alternative that is convincing to people who are disadvantaged right now. I don't believe their version, but people do want hope somewhere. They want opportunities.
Well, on that note, let's thank Michael.
Thank you.
And we'll take a break for coffee and come back at 10:30.